All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Next Century Cities 5G webinar. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. My name is Kat Blake, and I'm the Policy and Program Manager at Next Century Cities. I'm going to go over a few quick notes before we get started here. First is that we are asking everyone to remain on mute so that we can reduce the impact of background noise on the webinar. Second is that this webinar will be recorded and shared on our resource page later today, should you want to refer back to it or share it with others. Next is that I want to make it clear that our goal for this webinar, as always, is to make it as interactive and audience-driven as possible. So please feel free to send us your questions at any time, either via the chat box or by emailing me, Kat, at the address seen on your screen. And we'll be sure to answer your questions throughout the webinar. Finally, I just want to mention that Next Century Cities has two exciting events coming up. City Vendor Connect in Kansas City, Missouri on June 25th, as well as a Regional Broadband Summit in Pittsburgh this July. So you can find more information about both of these on our website, and be sure to keep an eye on your inbox for more updates. So before I hand this off to Chris Mitchell, who will be moderating today, I want to give a quick overview of a few recent actions that Next Century Cities has recently taken to protect local control and what this has to do with the fund. 1 minute. Okay. So, last month, Next Century Cities sent a letter to
I think we're going to need Pam out in Eugene to mute the mic, please.
I think everyone's muted. Sorry about that. And as folks join, please just make sure that your mics have been muted.
Pam was mic'd or muted and then was not again.
Okay. If you can hear me, please just be sure to stay on mute to reduce the background noise. We really appreciate it. Okay, great. So last month, Next Century Cities sent a letter to the FCC signed by 35 of our members. And this letter called for local decision-making around 5G investments, and it also pushed back on the increasingly common industry narrative that cities are the main barrier to small cell deployment. So instead, the mayors and local leaders in this letter called for collaboration between municipalities and industry and urged the FCC not to take action to decrease local authority. So this letter was sent in response to recent FCC actions that have threatened to limit municipalities' authority over pole attachments and the right to charge market value for the use of poles in the public right-of-way, among other things. Secondly, Next Century Cities recently commissioned research to be conducted by independent researcher RVA LLC on the current status of 5G infrastructure in communities. This research has proved key insights on small cell deployments, pole use and rates, and the importance of collaboration. So you can find more information about both the letter and the research at the links shown on your screen. And Deb has also kindly entered these links into the chat box so that you can easily copy and paste them into your browser. Okay, so with that background information, I'll go ahead and introduce the speakers for today, who will be sharing more about each of the issues. Christopher Mitchell is Next Century Cities Policy Director and will be moderating today's webinar. And Mayor Gary Resnick is joining us from Milton Manors, Florida. Mayor Resnick was one of the signatories on the letter to the FCC, also a telecom lawyer at Gray Robinson. Joining us also is Michael Render, the CEO and president of RVA LLC, and the primary researcher for Next Century Cities market research. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Chris to get us started.
Thank you, Kat. I was planning on doing a little bit of additional basic background on 5G to make sure we're all on the right or on the same page. And then we're going to ask Gary to do a little bit of context, why this is important for our cities. We're very fortunate to have both Gary and Mike with us today. They're both very knowledgeable about this in different ways. So I want to get to that as quickly as possible. You can always start asking questions at any point as they come up. So with 5G, means many different things in the press. It's really the latest generation of wireless is generally being lumped together in something called 5G. We're thinking about it primarily on the mobile side of it, which is you can think of the technologies that'll improve our handsets, our cell phones, our iPads, and things like that. There's also other aspects of 5G that sometimes get lumped together, such as better millimeter waves for fixed wireless, where you might be shooting from one rooftop to another rooftop of very high capacity. But we're just focused on the mobile side of it right now, and so that's really the technology used by the big wireless telephone companies. Now, many people are familiar with seeing macro towers, where you might see, like, it's often an array of 3 antenna sites, all on one structure that's located maybe 100, 200 feet above the ground. Those may serve an area multiple miles in radius, and you may have several of them in decent-sized towns and a lot of them in the larger cities. The microcells that we're moving into now, where we're getting much smaller technologies, will be closer to us. They'll be closer to the ground, maybe 30 feet, 50 feet, 80 feet up. They'll have a much smaller radius that they'll be serving. In part, it's solving the problem that wireless inevitably has, which is that you're sharing a valuable resource across many people. And the macro cells basically serve too many people, so they can't deliver high quality performance. So they're trying to get smaller radios that will serve smaller groups of people in order that everyone will have a better experience. Now, that's something that's going to be happening over the next several years, long before we get to 5G. It's already been happening, but 5G is just kind of a term that everyone seized upon. One of the things that we'll discuss is the state preemption, where states have gone and limited local authority as to how to deal with these in different ways. We have a great map that'll spell out some of the different ways that different states have acted. Thank you, Kat. That map is up now. So this is a map that was recently updated, and it shows the status of states that have changed the laws. Not all of the laws where there's new legislation is bad necessarily, although I do think I'll be pressing Gary to talk a lot about what Florida has done wrong in the hopes that we can prevent bad laws from being spread further. But the key thing I think that we'll get to and talk about is that cities do in fact need to have a strategy for dealing with these. We shouldn't be intimidated. In some ways, it'll be exciting to have better technology, but the technology is changing, and the sort of same old groups that have long wanted to steal local authority away from local governments, so that industry can more or less steamroll local governments, so that industry doesn't have to put up with dealing with pesky citizen complaints. That's just it's another day, another battle in that front. So I don't want to suggest that this is new. Many of you have been through this many times. The final thing was just to reaffirm that even as we're getting better wireless, we will in fact still need high quality wired service. The 5G specification specifically expects that each of the wireless nodes will be connected with a fiber. We don't think that's going to be totally true in practice, much like there are some cells that claim to be 4G LTE right now in the field that cannot deliver anything more than a meg or two a second because they have very limited backhaul. So we will need fiber to these wireless access points. That's another aspect that your cities will have to be dealing with. But it all goes together in the future that we'll have more wires and more wireless services. So with that very basic background, I want to turn it over to Gary for more of a sense of, as a mayor, as someone who represents local businesses, local residents, why does this matter? Why do we have to pay attention to it? And what should we be looking at?
All right. Well, thanks, Chris. Thanks for the intro, and I want to thank Next Century Cities for setting up this webinar. So I'm not going to really use the term 5G much because, as you indicated, it doesn't exist, and we don't know exactly when it's going to be launched. But I'll probably refer more to advanced broadband services, and we all know that these are incredibly important for communities. I mean, everything from economic development to the use by our residents, our students, it's absolutely essential for education. as well as for the delivery of city services. Cities are huge consumers of advanced broadband services, both wireline and wireless. For economic development now, one of the first questions I'm asked by any developer, whether it's residential or commercial, is what broadband services are available in the community. Because they cannot build an office building, a large apartment complex, whatever, if there's not significant broadband services available to their potential tenants or people that are going to be buying the units. So it's absolutely essential for economic development. And in fact, I just had a conversation last week with someone who wants to build a technology-based office building in my city. And their first question was who they could contact for getting fiber installed into the building and what kind of broadband services they're going to have available wirelessly throughout the property. So it is essential, and we recognize that. And local governments, let me state first off that local governments do not want to stand in the way of broadband services in their communities. In fact, if they're not available, many local governments will actually do whatever it takes to make such services available on their own, whether they have to install fiber or conduit or do whatever it takes to make it easier to deploy advanced broadband services in their communities. So local governments understand the incredible importance of these services and are doing whatever is necessary to make sure that they are available. From the student education standpoint, we hear all the time now about the homework gap. I think it's a term that some senators used when I testified in the Senate last month, as well as members of the FCC are using. And basically what it means is, teachers are assigning homework to students that requires broadband to do the homework. And the FCC has stats, but there's an incredibly large number of students that do not have broadband access at home. For whatever reason, either it's not accessible where they live, or it's just too expensive is typically the reason. Broadband in this day and age is not affordable to many, many people. And so our libraries, my city's library, is packed after school with students just looking for a place to get access to broadband to be able to do their homework. So that's incredibly important for communities as well. And then we talk about health services, all the services that are essential to communities, as well as entertainment. Broadband services now are essential. They're not a luxury. They're not something that would be nice to have. They're essential for people's quality of life. And indicated before with respect to city services, our police, fire, code enforcement, permitting departments, all of them rely on advanced broadband services, including advanced wireless services. We could not perform services for the benefit of our residents without advanced broadband services, including wireless services, available throughout our entire communities, which is one of the challenges that we have, especially with 5G and the technology that is talked about to deploy 5G, namely small cell technology. So we understand that many of the carriers now are doing trials with respect to 5G service. As I indicated, it's still not available commercially by any carrier, but they are engaged in trials. But there are several concerns that cities have, that I have as a mayor, and that my colleagues in cities and counties around the country have with respect to the technology. First of all, Chris touched on it a little bit, but the deployment of facilities for advanced wireless broadband services is not a very simple deployment. While the technology is referred to as small cell technology, the small really refers to the distance that the signal will travel. It doesn't refer to the size of the technology. Small cell technology will basically provide signal for 2 or 3 blocks at maximum. So you need a lot of the facilities deployed. But it's not a panacea for getting wireless broadband services to areas that currently don't have it. And as Chris mentioned, all of these, so in addition to the small antenna facilities that are installed, These are typically installed on a utility pole. What we're seeing mostly is anywhere from 35 to 75 feet utility poles that the industry wants to install in the rights-of-way. These are typically concrete or metal poles, and so it's a pretty big installation in the rights-of-way. And typically these facilities are also accompanied by an equipment box or a cabinet that's generally about the size of a large refrigerator. So the package for one single small cell installation is typically a large utility pole with an equipment box nearby and a small cell antenna technology installed, co-located on top or on the side of the utility pole. And it's really not all areas of the rights-of-way are appropriate for these facilities to be installed. They can disrupt the rights-of-way. Our sidewalks have ADA requirements. They can be incompatible with businesses and residential areas, as well as block clear zones and site triangles. And so cities need to have an important say in the installation and placement of these facilities in the rights-of-way. As Chris also mentioned, all of these facilities need to be connected via fiber. And so there's the potential for tremendous disruption of the rights-of-way. If fiber is going to be installed underground, we see this all the time. Typically, utilities are damaged as a result of such installation. There's just so much already underground in the rights-of-way that it's almost impossible to do major installation and major construction without damaging already underground utilities such as water and sewer. One of the communities that's right next to mine had their sewer system damaged by an underground installation of fiber for 5G technology, and it cost $600,000 to fix it. So these are difficult installations. They can often be very disruptive to residents and other users of the rights-of-way, as well as to residents with respect to delivery of other services. So the actual physical installation of the facilities is a concern to local governments. Actually, one of our bigger concerns, though, is not so much with the physical installations, but with how these services are going to be deployed and what areas are going to have the advantages from advanced wireless broadband services, and what areas are going to be left out of technology evolution that's taking place. We've often referred to this in the past as a digital divide. I just simply like to call it the have and have-nots, because digital divide might be like an archaic term at this point. But if there's a general acceptance that everybody throughout the country is going to need advanced wireless broadband service, and that it's not a luxury, that it's not something that people can do without, but it's going to be something that's going to be necessary basically throughout the entire country, then we need to come up with a policy to make sure that it is going to be available throughout the entire country. And unfortunately, the policies that are being put into place now by states, and the policies also, I think, that the FCC are looking at, do not do that.
I think if I can interrupt you, Mr. Gary, I'd like to come back to that, the issue of the FCC in the Q&A period, so you don't have to jump too deep.
I won't go into that now, right? I just wanted to, indicate though that the technology does not lend itself to being installed in areas that do not have a lot of potential customers. It's because the signal is available for only a short area, and it's a fairly difficult and expensive install because of the not only the facilities for the small cell system itself, but also the fiber. There's just no business case that the industry can support to deploy this technology in rural areas or in suburban areas, or even in inner cities, if there's not going to be a lot of potential customers to buy 5G service. Or what they're really installing now is the densification of 4G service. So the industry has been very candid with the fact that there's just not a business case for the tremendous investment that's necessary to deploy this technology in a lot of areas of the country. There is the business case in dense areas where there's already significant usage of wireless broadband service, and they need to increase the capacity in those areas. But there's just not a case for the capital investment in other areas outside of dense urban core. And then one thing I want to address finally is one of the concerns of local governments, since we're leaving out a lot of the areas that would benefit from this technology and from these services, is that that the service is frankly going to be priced at a level that's unaffordable for most Americans. AT&T and something I read indicated that they anticipate pricing commercial 5G at about $140 to $150 a month. That's out of reach of most residents. When you look at what they're paying now for communication services, for video, for landline services, you know, we're talking about monthly bills to residents for basic service that we indicate that they need of about $400 to $500 a month, and that's just frankly unaffordable. And when you look at the fact that under state laws, taxpayers are subsidizing the deployment of these facilities because we're either giving them free or basically free access to government paid for utility poles and rights of way, it should be something that should be available to all citizens at affordable rates. So I'll stop there. Those are basically, you know, as I indicated, local governments are not trying to stop the deployment of these technology. We absolutely want the technology, but we have concerns with respect to how it's being deployed and who's going to have access to the services at affordable rates. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mayor Resnick. We're going to move on to Michael Render, who did a study for us, or we worked with him to get the study done more accurately, that was looking at what are some of the facts, because we don't really have a sense of what's happening in a lot of places across the United States. You know, we know a little bit about what's happening in some areas, but we wanted to get a sense of the larger picture. And it's worth noting that as Gary and I will speak about some of these issues, we tend to have strong opinions about whether or not the cities are being abused, whether or not there's certain very bad policy decisions being made. Mike is very much focused on just the facts of you know, what is being charged, how many cities have policies, things like that. So, Mike, please take it away.
Okay, very good. Well, we'll give you the results of this research. This was, as you turn to the next slide, I'll show you the methodology here, but looks like there was some issue with the slides here. It may have something to do with transition to Apple or something, I'm not sure. But anyway, we did a study of both smart city applications and small cell based on a sample of 176 cities. We're really trying to focus on what's happening, what's actually happening, what's the attitude, what's the expectation. Go ahead and turn to the next slide, Kat. And so there was 176 total interviews. These were among, typically they're not just a random sample of all 20,000 places in the U.S. It tends to be more technology-focused communities, basically members of Next Century Cities, the TOA, ULI, APA, but especially Next Century Cities. So keep that in mind. It's not a random sample, but looking at the leading edge, basically. Next slide. So we did see that small cell deployment is underway, and I'm just going to concentrate on small cell for this presentation. It's also clearly correlated, as we'll see in the next slide, with both city size and the ability to have access to existing fiber. Well, here's the status currently, and so small cells, 44% are seeing, let's see, 26% are seeing some activity, another 20% under consideration. So next slide, please. Here you can see that there's a correlation with both fiber activity and the size of the city. So at one end of the spectrum, you can see that with under 50,000 community and no fiber, 18% are seeing small cells deployed. On the other end of the spectrum, 500 plus with residential fiber in the city already, 100% are seeing deployment. So next slide. So we are seeing public-private cooperation, according to people. And on the other hand, as we'll see, cities could be somewhat more proactive in getting policies deployed for deployment of small cells. Next slide. So again, I apologize for the format here of these slides, but collaboration with agreement, 41%, no agreement, 27%. In total, 68% reported some kind of collaboration. And the other 32%, they may have had contact with providers between the city and the provider, but not much collaboration. Next slide. So again, 35% show small cells completed, and the rest are under process. Next slide. We are seeing them on multiple kinds of structures. As you can see on the next slide, we do see the majority on telephone poles and electrical poles, but we're also seeing them on new poles, as the mayor mentioned, at billboards, buildings, and other structures. We're seeing a wide variety of deployments, some that look attractive and some that certainly are not. And you know, I've even seen examples of providers offering to build new steeples with small cells inside. So some are being creative and finding ways to do this attractively. Next slide. We see a wide variety in the percent of streetlights owned by the city at one end of the spectrum. Cities own most of the poles, and the other end of the spectrum, cities own few of the streetlights. So that's one aspect of the asset that they have and the control that they have. Next slide. The lease rate per pole, and this is a small sample because we, of the 176, only a smaller proportion were actually leasing streetlight poles and poles of any type for small cells at this point. But you can see a wide variance from over $2,000 to under $1,000. The average and median on this small sample was $1,200 per pole in terms of city lease rates reported. Next slide. As the mayor mentioned, cities are quite concerned, and we're looking at this from just a research, non-biased point of view. We're not involved in policy advocacy in our firm, but we saw that most cities are quite concerned about maintaining local oversight and control. And at the same time, they note that some providers, they've had complaints about excessive permitting times, and in some cities, residents, some representatives say that cities should come to the table in that aspect, but they are concerned about recovering reasonable costs, obtaining fair market values, and certainly maintaining aesthetics and safety. Next slide. Complaints received. The number one complaint that that city representatives noted was citizens complaining about the look or aesthetics of deployments in their neighborhood, and then providers regarding the time required for permitting, and following that, safety concerns from citizens, and provider concerns regarding costs for right-of-ways or poles. Next. We asked what cities are greatly concerned about, or what they're concerned about on a 5-point scale. And this is the percent that said they're very concerned, a 5 rating. Number one was avoiding state laws passed without city input. Then federal laws. After that, the safety and aesthetics, all very close, maintaining reasonable revenue. All 5 were pretty large issues, as you can see, but especially the state laws is coming to the top at the moment. Next slide. And we did look at where these people were mentioning they had a law passed or pending in their state. 17% had a law passed. Another 21% said laws were in consideration. So we picked up about 15 states, I believe, that at that point actually did, according to Next Century Cities, have a law passed or under consideration that these were mentioned in our sample. Next slide there. And what the perception is overwhelmingly negative relating to these laws. You know, in some cases, as Chris mentioned, the laws do vary. In some cases, representatives were reasonably happy with the law, and of course it depends on their position in the city, I'm sure, as well. But overwhelmingly negative on laws passed. 2/3 were negative to the laws. On the laws under consideration, 84% were negative. Next slide. And finally, we asked people open-ended questions about why these state laws were considered negative. And there's a number of reasons. We consolidated those into different kinds of categories. And there are many, but we're just showing you the top 10 here. Loss of preemption and local control was the biggest by about half. Concerns about aesthetics in large cabinets, as the mayor mentioned, 21%. Devaluing public assets, below value, you know, weighted in favor of providers, unrealistic time for permitting, feeling the previous system worked well. Some said it amounted to taxpayers subsidizing private companies, et cetera. So these were some of the top concerns of the city representatives in our sample. And I think there's one more slide to look at here. We asked people about what you would do to balance the need for technology, as many, even on this call, have mentioned there's a need for better technology, with an attractive and safe community. And some of the same answers, some different. Stop limiting local control, aesthetics determined by the community, and you can see down the list. But basically trying to balance the need for maintaining reasonable costs for the city and aesthetics with the need for the technology. So that's a quick overview of our survey, which seemed to point out some of the facts that have been mentioned by Gary Resnick and others in this webinar. And I'll turn it back over to you, Chris.
Thank you. So we've had a couple of questions come through the chat box. It's worth noting that Donna noted that Maryland had legislation that was pending. It was pulled back. The legislature is now done for the year, so there's no additional threat there. But there's a question that has been already addressed a little bit in the chat box, but I'd like to share it with everyone because not everyone can see that. And so, Mayor Resnick, I'd like to ask you, what are you seeing in terms of Florida, where, perhaps you can start off with just a note of the limitations, just the key limitations under Florida law that you've been put into a straitjacket over, and whether or not you can tell if that's supercharging deployment at all.
Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background, the Florida legislative session is 60 days. In 2017, this was a priority of the wireless industry to get a state small cell bill passed. AT&T had 90 registered lobbyists for the 160 or so Florida legislators. And so the bill passed in 60 days. It went through a series of revisions through the legislative process, sausage making. And so as a result, the final bill that was adopted is about 20 pages. It's new legislation. There's been nothing that existed in Florida before with respect to access to the rights of way for wireless facilities. So it's a whole new comprehensive scheme for allowing wireless facilities to get access to the rights of way, as well as to city and county owned utility and traffic and light poles. So it's a complicated piece of legislation. There's 500 or so local governments in Florida, all of which have to do something to enact this state statute. And it's complicated and it's hard to understand, and the cities and counties are having a hard time figuring out how to do that. And there's not the statute calls for local. The statute did maintain a lot of local authority with respect to establishing location and design standards for these facilities in each individual local government's rights of way, which we like. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. But so none of these ordinances look really the same. Local governments are coming up with their own ways of implementing the statute in their own codes with industry participation. We want the industry to participate in that process. So the process to adopt the codes by local governments is taking longer, I think, than what anybody anticipated, and also costing a lot of money. I mean, these costs, it's a tremendous use of local government and taxpayer resources to adopt an ordinance to implement the statute. And we are not seeing a lot of deployment. I don't know if it's because the industry is not really ready yet to deploy these facilities. As I indicated, they're still in trials with respect to 5G, but there have been some applications submitted in some jurisdictions to deploy small cell facilities. As I indicated, generally in like the very urban, dense areas of some cities where there's a lot of downtown activity, where there's a lot of restaurants and urban downtown activity. We haven't seen a lot of requests for deployment in residential areas, and certainly not at all in rural areas, and even not a lot in inner city areas where they don't have that type of business use. So there's not been a lot of deployments, notwithstanding the fact that the Florida statute was adopted and became effective in July of last year. And there's also a lot of confusion. As I indicated, the statute was adopted in a 60-day legislative time period. It was revised several times through the process. There's internal inconsistencies in the statute, specifically with respect to local control over physical deployment of the facilities and what authority local governments have to indicate where these can go and what they have to look like. And there's been actually some litigation already. An industry trade association sued a city in Florida, and the case was dismissed, but it shows that there's not a real cooperative mindset now between the industry and local governments. The industry still seems interested in doing what they want to do without a lot of local government say, and the local governments are doing what they need to do to protect their residents and businesses from deployment of these facilities where they would not be appropriate. So there's not been a lot of cooperation yet between the industry and the local governments.
I wanted to note in the survey also, and Mike, you can remind me on the numbers. We saw what was surprising to me, a significant percentage of cities saying that they already had some deployments, and that was pretty well centered within the largest cities, I believe. Is that right, Mike?
Yes, there is certainly the larger the city, the more likely there was to be deployment. We did ask how many. Well, no, we didn't actually ask that on smart cities, but on small cells. But it's likely that the amount of actual construction is small, but there was a reasonable percentage of these larger, more technology-focused communities in our sample that we're seeing at least some activity. So.
And I think it's worth noting that the single highest profile one, to my knowledge, and I was just searching around to try and refresh myself if there was other cities to see any correlation, because Verizon's announced that they're going to have it in 5 cities very soon, and Sacramento is the first one. It's worth noting that in Sacramento, they considered and passed a bill that would have really limited local authority, but the governor vetoed it. So Verizon chose to go to Sacramento and actually struck a deal with the city of Sacramento, in which I think Sacramento gave very attractive terms to Verizon in order to be the first city that has this. But if you read the contract, I believe they may be giving the poles away for free, but they value the poles in terms of the deal at $2,000 per location per year. And as you saw with Mike's data, that's pretty. It's not an outlier in terms of what we're seeing from cities like Lincoln and Boston, and then there's a lot of cities for whom they're charging $2,000 per year per poll, despite the fact that the median was $1,200 per poll. In any event, it's certainly a lot higher than $150 per poll that Florida limits charges to.
Back to that, Mike. This is Gary. Before the Florida statute passed, Verizon had an agreement with at least one city in Florida, and they were paying $2,000 per poll pursuant to that agreement as well. So.
Right, and it's worth noting also that, to give a sense, the cost of installation for these is over $25,000 per poll for them when you look at the materials and the labor and everything else. So, charging a significant amount per poll per year is not something that's out of line for the kinds of scale that's coming into here. In fact, if I was smart, I would have done the number of users that it would take to recover those costs per year, given the size of our phone bills. But I wanted to ask, I think it's really important to get into some of the issues that Mayor Liccardo from San Jose has brought up and Gary alluded to, which have to do with concern that these investments will not be made in areas that are historically marginalized, specifically low-income communities. And so, Gary, I'm curious if you can give us a sense of, when you're thinking about this and talking about it, what might a fair deal look like to make sure that we're able to address like historic inequities in investment?
Well, I think that's been offered a few places. Just so you know, the Florida legislation as well does not provide for any type of build-out requirement. It doesn't allow local governments to mandate that these facilities be installed in any particular areas of a city or a county. And so the industry has carte blanche authority to decide where they want to deploy 5G technology. And that's, I believe, not just Florida's legislation, but all states' legislation that have passed throughout the country so far. And that's also what the FCC is considering in terms of the notice of proposed rulemaking that they've issued, as well as in terms of what the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, or BDAC, has recommended so far. There's not going to be any requirements on the industry to deploy facilities in any particular areas. And this is not only a concern of local governments, but it's a concern of federal legislators. When I testified in the Senate, one of the senators on the committee was from Montana, and he said, folks in his state still don't have access to 1G, let alone 5G. And he was asking the industry members on my panel when they would ever deploy to Montana. And frankly, the answer was probably never. There's just not a business case that anybody can make to have the industry make the capital investment to deploy in a rural area like Montana. And the same exists in inner cities. I was one county in Florida that considered an ordinance to adopt the Florida statute is Leon County. It's where Tallahassee is. It's a very urban county for the most part. It has a lot of inner city, lower income areas. And one of the county commissioners asked, will you deploy in inner city Leon County, because we have a lot of people there that don't have access to advanced wireless broadband at all, let alone anything that's affordable. And if we're giving you basically free access to our poles and free use of the rights of way, will you deploy in inner city Leon County? And the industry said no, that we have absolutely no intention of deploying these facilities in those areas. So that's a big concern. Our taxpayers are subsidizing this technology. We can't charge permit fees. As you indicated, the Florida cap on a pole attachment fee is $150 per year. And these companies don't pay for access to the rights of way. So the taxpayers are subsidizing all that, and they're not providing a public service in terms of making these advanced services available where they're truly needed. So I think there's a lot left to be said for the policy that's been enacted to date.
So I wanted to remind people that we're open to questions. You can either use the chat or our cat. The email address is on the screen currently. It's C Blake, Cat Blake, C Blake at nextcenturycities.org. If you want to send her an email, she can ask it. Kat, have we had any come in?
Not yet, but I am on the lookout for them.
Great. Let me pause for a second to see if anyone who's on the phone, perhaps without access to writing down on text, has a question. All right. I wanted to. I had a plan, and then I paused.
Well, let me just also. I think you had asked me also about the FCC.
Yes,
and I referenced a little bit about the BDAC. The BDAC was created by the chairman of the FCC to provide advice and recommendations to the FCC, both with respect to state policies that the FCC may want to recommend as far as state statutes, as well as local policies that the FCC may want to recommend as far as ordinances for cities and counties to consider.
And I just want to really clarify that to be very clear so people get it. Like, this is a process in which basically the FCC will release basically model policies that they will encourage others, but there will be no force behind them unless states adopt them themselves, correct?
Well, that's what they've indicated, but you never know. I mean, I understand, at least one FCC commissioner is totally on board with preempting states and local governments and Indian tribes for that matter, and just forcing them to adopt regulations that the FCC issues, or not adopt, but forcing them to comply with regulations that the FCC issues. So far, the chairman has indicated that it's not his intention to force states and cities to adopt those model statutes and ordinances, but the danger becomes when something gets out there as a model and it becomes basically the standard. And if there's litigation about what a state or a city adopts, the courts will tend to look at what the FCC has indicated is the standard for appropriate legislation. So it becomes a slippery slope once something gets put out by the FCC as the standard for such legislation. And the BDAC, unfortunately, was created kind of very skewed with industry members. I believe that there's 30 members, and I think 27 of the members were basically affiliated with the industry. Either worked directly for the industry or were consultants for the industry. And only 3 members were either state or local government officials. And that's why the mayor from San Jose resigned. He thought that it wasn't worth his taxpayers' time and resources to have him participate in this process, since there was no opportunity for him to provide meaningful input. So he resigned from the committee. And recently, the chief technology officer for the city of New York resigned for the same reason. Although a new member was just appointed to the BDAC, who's a city staff person. I believe he's the franchise manager from the city of Lincoln, Nebraska, who has a great background with respect to implementing small cell technology in the city of Lincoln.
That's right, so David Young. We've had him on some of our things in the past. Right.
So hopefully he'll be able to actually have some input with respect to the process being developed through the BDAC. But we'll see. The process itself is the structure is skewed so much towards not allowing input or giving local governments and state governments, for that matter, a seat at the table, that it's questionable as to whether it's really a legitimate process.
So we have a question about Crown Castle. And Crown Castle is one of several companies that we call neutral host companies, basically, in that they tend to be facilitators for others to get into the right of way. So Crown Castle may provide a one-stop shop for a wireless provider to be able to deploy in multiple areas of town. And Donna is asking if anyone knows for sure that they'll be able to support 5G. There is some discussion that AT&T has said that Crown may not be supporting 5G. That strikes me as unlikely. But Gary, you're a lawyer in this business. I'm guessing you have more insight.
Well, I've met with Crown Castle numerous times, both in Florida and in other states, and they are building facilities. I know that they have installed facilities in other cities and in other states, not for 5G at this point, but to provide densification of existing wireless technology. As we indicated, 5G doesn't exist currently. So and the standards don't exist for it. So I'm not sure if they are going to be able to do that or not. They haven't deployed any 5G technology, to the best of my knowledge, yet anywhere. But they have deployed facilities that are used by AT&T and others, basically to densify and improve the wireless signal in dense urban areas.
For people to understand how odd it is, I feel like a normal person might look at this and say, well, is something 5G or is it not? How are we in Alice in Wonderland when it comes to 5G? Yeah, I think the answer is that wireless technology, this particular brand of cellular, not brand, but this particular type of wireless technology goes through multiple revisions, and the engineers and the various folks that work on this sort of thing are constantly improving it. And so they basically come up with a list of things, and they say if you have these things in your wireless gear, then it's 4G. And then as they add things to it over time, they eventually get to 5G. It's worth noting a lot of 4G still doesn't meet a lot of the items that are on the list to be called 4G. And there's just an issue with marketers using those terms versus engineers. So it is very much in flux, and that's how, to some extent, we have a sense of where 5G is coming and what the standard is likely to be around, but it has not been specified, as Gary said. I wanted to ask a question of Mike while we have you here. That's not related to this survey, but I told you that I'd be asking it because I think the audience will be interested in it. Mike has done a lot of work into surveys looking at people's perception of fiber and internet access. And Mike, I just wanted you to briefly give us a sense of based on your surveys, do people prefer fiber? Do they actually are they looking for advanced services when they're making home decisions and things like that?
Yes, absolutely. We've done consumer surveys for about 12 years now, and internet in general is becoming very, very important to people. Spending hours per day. Many people working from home, have home-based businesses, and so indeed, when we ask people what's important in their life, what's important when they go to a community, fiber is right. Good broadband is right near the top, and more people are recognizing that fiber itself has an advantage, not just for speed in terms of bandwidth, but also in terms of reliability. Less amplifiers and so forth mean that there's just more stability. And we ask people things like, how often do you have to reboot your modem or call customer service? And those things are significantly less with fiber than other methods. So people do get it. They do translate it even to things like home value. When we ask them questions about buying a new home, they would spend significantly more, about 3% more, for a home that already has fiber, even knowing that other homes may eventually get fiber. So it does create a premium, even more so for rental when you're looking at a short-term time horizon, about an 8% advantage, just for having the advantage of fiber broadband, which is perceived to have higher stability and speed. So yes, certainly important. Technology is important. It's important for cities. We're seeing, done some studies of economic growth in cities that have a high degree of fiber to the residents versus those that don't, and seeing a big difference there. So obviously broadband, both in terms of fixed broadband to the home in terms of fiber, and wireless with fiber to the small cell or to the large cell, is very important to people. So that is true. And on the other hand, people do value things like aesthetics and character of communities and things like that, from what we've seen.
And Mike, your research tends to show up in Broadband Communities magazine, right? And on the website for Broadband Communities.
It does, yes. We work with the Fiber to the Home, Fiber Broadband Association, formerly Fiber to the Home Council. So many of our studies are public there, and we have done many things that have been published by Broadband Communities magazine as well.
Great. We have one last question before we get to.
Can I just chime in on
Please.
1 second on that? We
Yes.
see that directly in my city as well as throughout other cities in Florida. As you know, Florida is very subject to hurricanes, very, very strong weather issues. We had a tornado yesterday that came through Fort Lauderdale, where I'm located. And so what we've seen, especially in the during and after of hurricanes and with respect to recovery efforts, wireless service is typically the last to be restored. Fiber, often service won't even go out if it's an underground technology, both with respect to electric services as well as communication services. And cities that have or communities that have underground utilities, including communications utilities, typically do not lose service. But pretty much the 58 of the 67 counties that were impacted by Hurricane Irma in Florida all lost electric service, all lost overhead communication service, and all lost wireless service. When you're doing recovery efforts, the first to get restored is electric, but then wireline communications follows at the same path and the same time frame. So in terms of resiliency during and after storms, it's much preferable to have wireline service as opposed to wireless service. And now what we're seeing is all communities are installing these technologies underground, and they are installing fiber, and the rents and the prices in those communities are higher than in communities that have overhead facilities or wireless facilities.
Thank you, Gary. Regarding the conversation about Crown Castle, Deb said that she's very happy to put anyone in touch with her Crown Castle contact. They are planning to be in the 5G space as a neutral provider still, but she's happy to connect folks. That's Deb at nextcenturycities.org. And then the final question is one that I think might be a resource that has to be developed, but it's a question of whether anyone has access to some of the leases that are commonly paid by carriers to landowners that are, or building owners that are renting land for small cell or macro sites. I don't know if you know of any resources like that, Mike or Gary.
Well, the only deployment of small cell and micro wireless facilities, at least that's occurring in Florida or that's planned to be occurring in Florida, is all on rights of way. There's no, they'd have to go through a land use process, through in the local government to whether it's if it's on private property, whether it's macro cell or small cell. And so I don't think the industry is looking to pay rent or go through a land use process to get approvals to install facilities on private property.
Okay, we do see those, and I've been seeing them more often now that I look for them. Often apartment buildings in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, that are privately owned have some of these macro cell arrays on them. So it may vary by region.
No, macro definitely. I mean, macro has always been on private property. Probably every tall condo building that I'm looking at now on the beach. By the way, it's about 80 degrees, and I'm looking at the ocean right now. But sorry for those of in the Northeast or wherever that it's snowing or something. But every condo building, large apartment building, large hotel, office building, etc., in Florida has macro antennas located on the rooftop, it still has to go through the land use process, and they pay rent. But that's fine. I mean, that's allowed generally under most cities' land use and zoning authority.
So I think the answer to the question, to the best we can do, is that there is no real sheet like that we have access to. But I will say my understanding is Boston tried to get a sense of what the rate was for areas in which you might have a neutral host providing service. And they got the sense that the neutral host charged more than the city was in their agreement. So, and that was, I believe, $2,000 per year per location. So it seems like the private sector. One other thing, I don't know if anyone has access to this, but we've been trying to figure out a lot of light poles are owned by investor-owned electric utilities. And so there's been a question as to how much they're charging, and also whether or not the revenue that they're getting for that goes back to the ratepayers or if it just goes to the investors. With any luck, someone will dig in and try to find some answers to that. Final comment is William says it's also not snowing in Los Angeles. William, you're a terrible person. Coming to you from St. Paul, Minnesota. Kat, I think you may have the final word now that I've insulted one of the folks in our audience. Thank you, William.
Always a good way to end a webinar. Thanks so much. So I just want to give everyone another quick reminder that this webinar will be available both on our resource page and on Next Century Cities YouTube page later this afternoon if you want to share it with anyone or refer back to it. And my apologies for the way that the slides converted. Mike, I'll be sure to send an email out to all of the attendees and just go ahead and attach the original slides for that if anyone wants to refer to those data slides. So with that, I just want to say thanks to everyone for joining our call today, and thank you to Chris, Michael, and Gary for sharing all of your wisdom. We're very appreciative. And yeah, thanks again. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Great. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.